The first is the practice of savoring. And what I love about savoring is that savoring celebrates the ordinary. So all those moments that your brain is tempted to dismiss, savoring helps us notice and capture those moments in a way that we can carry them forward and recall them later. And the way that you do this is if you can do it in the present moment. I love that. So, and it can be small. We're not talking about hours worth of material, just a snapshot as if you're taking a photograph of the present moment. Or some people like to do this at the end of the day as a reflective exercise before they go to bed. But whatever it is, whether it's a present moment or something that you're thinking about in reflection, you take one snapshot, one photograph of a moment, and you simply ask your 5 traditional senses what they're going to remember about a moment. So what do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you taste? And what do you feel? And that helps you preserve that memory and find joy in that moment in a way that you can actually savor it, keep it, and carry it forward. Just as a side note, if you struggle with anxiety like I do, this is also a great way to calm down and keep you very present. Because as we know, worry takes our brain into the future and tries to prepare us for all the what ifs and the worst case scenarios, or it drags us into the past where we start thinking what I coulda, shoulda, and would have done differently. And both of those are anxious responses, and this practice of savoring not only helps us glean more joy in our everyday lives, but keeps us very present and helps with that anxiety. A second practice that I wanted to mention is this idea of rituals and rhythms. And again, we are not talking about something expensive or elaborate. This can be a very simple rhythm in your week, whether it's taking a family walk every Sunday or sharing a special meal the same weeknight or weekend. Just something that you all can look forward to and that's practiced consistently in your family. And the reason that this is important is, like I said at the beginning, we tend to think of celebration as a reward for a good outcome. So something good happens, somebody achieves something great, there's some sort of breakthrough, and then we celebrate. And I think those are good and worthy celebrations. I don't want us to stop celebrating in the light of joy in those moments. I think that's a beautiful thing. Where I get concerned is when we limit our celebration to those moments. Because if we look at the celebrations outlined in the Old Testament, we see so many descriptions of beautiful feasts and festivals that the Israelites practiced. And by the time we read it in the New Testament, there were, I think, 7 main festivals. And these were practiced in rhythm. And what that means is that these celebrations didn't occur simply because the Israelites were in the mood to celebrate, or because they had achieved something great, or because all the work was finished and now they could rest and play. They were practiced in rhythm to help anchor them in God's faithfulness. So it was an exercise in remembering God's faithfulness and goodness, that rhythm component, versus merely celebration being a reaction to their own goodness. And I think this is so important in the life of our family, to celebrate in rhythm, because on the far side of that rhythm being established, what we start to recognize is that our bodies and our brains start to anticipate that. So I had a friend growing up where Sabbath was a really big deal in her family. Not that it isn't for all of us, but there were a lot of rhythms and rituals that her family practiced around Sabbath. Her mom would always play the same piano soundtrack at the start of Sabbath. They would open the windows. They lived in Southern California, so this was more doable than in Connecticut where I live year-round. But her mom would open the windows and fresh air would be blowing in and out of her home. And her mom would always bake a freshly baked bread from scratch. And so the smell of this freshly baked bread would be wafting through the house. And she reports that her shoulders would relax, her breathing would get deeper. She would just enter into this space, not only of the presence of the Lord, but just in connection with her family. And it was such a beautiful thing that her body had learned what that celebratory rhythm was. The other benefit of this that we talk about is that it takes our celebration puts it more around our personhood instead of our performance. Again, I'm going to encourage us to keep celebrating those little league wins and the A on the test that your child is really proud of. I'm not suggesting that we squish our celebration in response to those things. But to have some celebration that's practiced in rhythm outside of performance or outside of some sort of good outcome is a really healthy practice, not only for our own emotional well-being and spiritual well-being, but for the relationships between you and your children, and even between spouses in families. The third practice I want to talk about is the practice of thanksgiving. Now, we talk a lot, especially lately, the past few years in our culture, about gratitude. Seems like you can't walk into a boutique without seeing a gratitude journal or a gratitude jar. And that is a wonderful thing. The research is clear. Gratitude does increase our joy because it helps us notice and name what is good. So all of a sudden, our perspective is changing because we're scanning our environment for what is good. And that naming of it puts a structure around our gratitude that makes us more likely to hang on to it by putting words and language to it. What we don't often talk about is that the practice of Thanksgiving, actually expressing the gratitude that we feel, doubles the joy that we glean from gratitude. Now, the research also says that joy is the most vulnerable feeling that we feel because holding on to something, just the simple act of holding something like joy, is accompanied by the possibility of loss. When we hold something, we can lose it, which makes it vulnerable. And actually expressing that joy, sharing it with somebody else, is a vulnerable exercise too. But the research says it doubles the joy if we share it versus had we simply kept that feeling to ourselves. And I love this because there's such an opportunity here. With family members, our joy for each other tends to fade into the background, and maybe some of those idiosyncrasies and annoyances rise to the surface more easily because we are more apt to notice what is not going well versus what is. And I love this practice to just, if you think it, to share it, to say, here is the difference you make in my life. Here are the ways I've grown and changed because you're in my life. Here's what you're teaching me. Here's how I'm so thankful that you're different from me, and the gifts that God stored inside of you that are different than mine. I just so appreciate what you bring to our family. Just getting in the habit of speaking it, and if you need to start by writing it, I know that growing up, I treasure the notes that my parents wrote me about my character and how thankful they were for the person that I was. And yes, they celebrated my wins and the more tangible celebrations, but they also celebrated my personhood, and that made a huge difference in my identity formation as I was growing up and even now. So celebration is not always about adding something to our lives. I know I keep saying that we've narrowed that definition to be about adding something or changing something in our lives before we give ourselves permission to celebrate. But this is really a rhythm that we practice and acknowledges that a beautiful life, a wonderful life, is a life lived with Christ right where you are. And notice that all of the practices that I mentioned don't require anything in your life to change. And I know that all of us have desires for our family, either ways that we would love to see our family grow, and maybe improve in certain areas in terms of how we treat each other. I know that all of us carry burdens for our own children, whether it's physical healing or emotional healing or spiritual restoration. I know with each of my 3 kids, little as they are, because I have 2 boys and a girl, 6, 2, and 1. And already I carry hopes and dreams for them. My heart breaks for some of the things that they've endured or shared in their short lives. And so those are very real. Those hardships and those heartaches are real. Celebration is not about denying that those things are real and hard. It's not about expecting our joy to cancel our pain. That would be toxic positivity, and we don't do that here. This is simply about savoring those moments that are good and are happening too, and practicing celebration in a way that helps you experience more joy in the life that you're living now, even as you carry those burdens and prayers for what the future might hold and how God might move in a child's story or in your family's story.